Hello, inquirers. A quick note before my conversation with Andrew Coyne. The Society of Freethinkers is having its second annual Humanism in Action conference in Kitchener, Ontario on November 22nd, 2025. The theme is Ethics and Freedom, Values, Vision, Voices. I'll be a speaker there, and I hope that you'll be able to make it. I was at last year's conference. It's small, it's intimate, and you get to speak with everybody. It was a great deal of fun, and I learned a tremendous amount. You can learn more by clicking on the link in the show notes or going to sofree.ca/2025-humanist-conference. I hope to see you there. And now, my conversation with Andrew Coyne.
You start to see the pattern. You start to say, okay, this is not accidental. There's something that's probably underlying all of these things that's allowed our democracy to really kind of rot away over time. And it's just really not as strong as it should be, as it is in other countries, as it was previously in this country.
My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Andrew Coyne. Andrew Coyne is a columnist for the Globe and Mail and the author of The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. Andrew was raised in Winnipeg and graduated from the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics. In today's episode, Andrew makes the case that Canadian democracy is indeed headed for a crisis. He talks about the problems of Canada's first-past-the-post or winner-take-all electoral system. The conversation includes an analysis of a wide range of issues, the diminishing contributions that MPs can make, how candidates, cabinet members, and even party leaders are selected, and the ever-increasing power of the Prime Minister's office. Andrew outlines steps that can be taken to increase democratic representation in Canada that may avert a looming crisis of legitimacy. It is with pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Andrew Coyne on today's Podcast for Inquiry. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers? We have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Andrew Coyne, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to Podcast for Inquiry.
Pleasure to be with you.
I read your book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, and I thought it was a provocative title because I didn't think it was necessarily accurate, so I was interested in hearing your case. Unfortunately, I've lent my copy out to someone else, so I can't hold it up for you today. But I have never read in an introduction someone describing my perspective so accurately. When you're describing, I think you were trying to reach out to the typical Canadian, and you didn't introduce any new facts as such in your book, but you put them together in a way that was new to me, and so I'm very excited to have you here today. But for people like myself who hear the title of your book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, I'd like to start by hearing you outline why most people, including myself before reading your book, think that you are perhaps being hyperbolic, and why the coming into reading your book, why people believe that Canadian democracy is on a pretty solid footing.
Yeah, it's odd because you can also find data showing that people are very frustrated with the way our politics is conducted, with various aspects of our democracy. But when you put it together as Canadian democracy, people get very protective. Part of that is we're in Canada. We're a very fortunate country, one of the most blessed on earth. And there's a tendency to think that everything's fine here, or if anybody's suggesting otherwise, they must just not get it, or something to that effect. I think there's also, and these are a couple of things I tried to go at very directly in the book. There's a tendency, not just on this, but on any issue, for people want to feel like they're very worldly wise. And so when you raise these issues, you get one of two responses. One is, oh, I've been hearing this for years. This is an old story, as if that meant there was nothing there, right? Rather than perhaps it's been getting worse. And the other thing you hear is, oh, well, every country has its problems. Ours can't be any worse than elsewhere. So what I've tried to do in the book on both those fronts is bring in data to show that, no, in fact, things can and do get worse, and they have gotten worse on this front in Canada. And secondly, that it's worse on many measures than it is in other countries. So there's a tendency, an inbuilt tendency to complacency reinforced by people wanting to feel like that nothing's new to them. They've seen it all. And I think what I've tried to do also in the book is take these separate individual issues to do with the way Parliament works, the way members of Parliament work or don't work, to do with cabinet government, to do with the way we run our campaigns, the way we run our elections, all of which people can and have written whole books about those separate things. But when you pull it all together, you start to see the pattern. You start to say, okay, this is not accidental. There's something that's probably underlying all of these things that's allowed our democracy to really kind of rot away over time. And it's just really not as strong as it should be, as it is in other countries, as it was previously in this country.
Yes, and I think that was what I found about your book as well. I couldn't point to one chapter and say, this is the one that made me think that, okay, we've got a problem here. It was, we've got this, well, okay, and we've got this, well, okay, but then, again, taken as a whole on all these different fronts, and it does add up. And I don't think we're going to cover all of that in this conversation, because you've written an entire book about it. But I do want to cover a few items and move on to what can be done. And the first, I want to start with what is probably the most obvious and something that's not going to be new to anybody, and that is our first past the post system. And the last time at a federal level that a political party won 50% of the popular vote was Brian Mulroney back in the 1980s. But since then, we've had liberal and conservative, and then liberal majorities again, none of which got a 50% of the vote. We also had minority governments of those parties, as we do today. But we've had significant time majority governments without majority of the popular vote. So can you talk about first past the post and why this is, let's just say, an imperfect, less than ideal, and not as good as others, it's not anti-democratic, but it's not as democratic as other viable systems are.
Sure. Before I do, I wanted to put one last answer to your first question, just if I can
Sure.
fit it in, which is that the crisis of Canadian democracy is in part that people don't see it as a crisis. And one of the other reasons they don't see it as a crisis is things have slid so far, Parliament has become so irrelevant that people can't remember why they should have cared about it. They can't remember a time when Parliament was really relevant to them, and therefore they don't have anything to say, well, I'm bemoaning the loss of something, because it's disappeared from public view to such an extent. To come back to your present question, I think one of the ways to look at the whole first past the post question is to go through the various markers by which we usually think of a democracy. So you mentioned one off the top. When you ask about democracy, people will typically say, well, it's a system of majority rule. Ours is not a system of majority rule. As you mentioned, the last time there was a government that got 50% of the vote, it was back in the 80s. Typically, majority, quote unquote, governments are formed with 35, 37% of the vote. Why is that? Because the foundational thing of first past the post, another way of calling first past the post, is single member plurality. That's the technical name. We elect one member per riding, and it's just whoever has the most votes. The really key one, people tend to focus on the plurality part, but the really key one is the single member part. We tend to think of this as the natural and normal thing. Of course, you're only going to elect one MP per electoral district. In most countries on earth, that's not the case. Most countries on earth elect multiple members per district. Why? Because when you elect multiple members of district, you don't just represent the fraction of the vote that voted for the first place person. You're representing a much broader array of the people in that riding. Not everybody, of course, you can't do it perfectly, but you can get a much better approximation of the diversity of opinion within each riding. And then when you aggregate it across all ridings, you get a more representative thing in general. Again, we in North America, we're so immersed in sports metaphors. There can only be one winner of a football game. That this sounds to us like dirty pool, like somehow you're letting the losers get in. But once you get over the idea of there's actually no divine law that says there can only be one member per riding, then you start to say, well, yeah, if the point of the parliament is to represent us, why wouldn't we want to represent more of us than just that fraction of opinion? So one of the many distortions that gives rise to of only representing that proportion is you don't need to get a majority in each riding, and you don't need to get a majority in the country as a whole. Nevertheless, majority rule is really ingrained in us. If you were to propose, or someone were to propose, let's no longer require a majority of the MPs in the House of Commons to pass legislation. Let's say that 35% will be enough. People will be in the streets. It would be clearly wrong. But the only reason we think it was wrong is because we think at the back of our minds that majority in the House of Commons actually represents the majority of us, and it doesn't. So it's kind of trying to attach the form and the substance and tie them back together again. So that's one distortion. Second one, that if you ask me,
before we move on to the second one, I have been born and lived most, though not all, of my life here in Canada. How would multiple members per riding, like would we have half the number of ridings and each riding elects 2 MPs? And then the first and second most commonly voted for get sent up to Ottawa? Is that how that would work?
There's different models. The model that I prefer, so as I say, there are various models of proportional representation, but let's just focus on the fact that over 90 countries around the world use it, some form of it. So it's the norm, actually, in most places around the world. There are different models of it, but the idea that it should be proportional is the norm. We are one of the very, very few outliers. The system that I tend to prefer is the system that got 58% support in the BC referendum in 2005, I think it was, or the first time they put it to referendum. It's called single transferable vote. And without getting into all the weeds and the details of it, the basic thing is you'd have maybe 3 to 5 members per riding, certainly in urban areas. You could carve out for very sparsely populated areas, you might still have only 1 member per riding. But in urban areas, which is where most Canadians live, let's say 3 to 5 MPs per riding. And as I say, the counting of the vote can get complicated, but the long and the short of it is, roughly speaking, if you get 20% of the vote, you get 1 of those 5 MPs. If you get 40%, you get 2 of those 5 MPs. As I say, it's not exactly that, but close enough for our purposes.
Okay, so and then I, as a voter, would still vote for a single. I would.
No, you mark it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So so
I rank my preference.
Transferable vote. If you think of how parties elect their leaders, they do it by a transferable vote. And one of the reasons they do that is so that they don't get too polarizing and distorted a picture where it's winner take all one way or the other. Transferable vote means if your second preference doesn't, if your first preference doesn't get in, your second preference will get in, or maybe your third. So you're not finding that you're wasting your vote by voting for a candidate and then they never get in. So it's allowing again more representation.
Right. So that's the advantage of not having to do what we call strategic voting. I
was going to get to that. So I'll just very quickly.
I'm going to vote for the candidate I don't like to prevent the one I despise from getting in.
So let's take that one up then. Yeah. So another thing that people would say about democracy is you get to vote for the party of your choice, and yet election after election, large numbers of Canadians are told you can't. You cannot vote, let's say, for the New Democrats, because if you do, you'll just split the vote and let the Conservatives get in. So you have to vote for the Liberals, even though you don't really like the Liberals. Right. But you have to vote for them to stop the Conservatives. This is, people should be able to vote for the party they actually believe in. And when you have transferable votes, when you have more than 1 member per riding, there's much more opportunity to vote your heart, vote for the party you actually prefer, because you're more likely to actually help elect them. So you don't have to be just thinking about how do I prevent the worst person from getting in. You can actually try to promote the best person. So that's the second one. The third thing is, if you ask people what's democracy, they'll say, well, it's 1 person, 1 vote. Everybody gets to vote and every vote counts equally. Right. That manifestly is not the case. What first past the post tends to do, because it's just just the largest number of votes in each riding gets in, is it rewards parties that clump their votes geographically. If your vote is spread evenly across the country, classic example would be in the 1993 election. The Conservatives, the Reform Party, and the Bloc all got about 16% of the vote. But the Reform Party and the Bloc, because they were regional parties, got 50-odd seats, each of them, and the Conservatives got 2. This is crazy. And when you do the numbers on it, typically in an election, it's not going to be exactly this, but it's something along these lines. It takes about 30,000 votes to elect each Liberal MP. It takes about 40 or 50,000 to elect each Conservative. It takes about 60 or 70,000 to elect each New Democrat. And, the Greens get 800,000 votes and maybe get 1 or 2 MPs. So the effective weight of a vote is radically unequal depending on which riding you're in and which party you vote for. So again, if you were to do the experiment of, instead of handing each person 1 vote, we handed 20 votes to, a book full of 20 ballots to one person and 6 to another and 12 to this person and 4 to another and 0 to some other poor schmuck, people would riot. But right. That's effectively what we're doing.
There's another way in which votes are unequal in Canada, and that is the population per riding is very different. So I happen to live in a very urban area. I live in Toronto. I don't have the number of people in my riding, but it's hundreds of thousands. And in rural areas, there are some ridings that have tens of thousands. So if I live in a rural riding, I've got 150,000th of a vote or of an MP. My vote counts for 150,000th of that. Whereas in an urban riding, it might be as much as 1/10 of that, or at least 1/5 of that.
That's right. So there's the rural-urban split, which you see in a lot of countries. I don't think it's right, but it's quite common. Canada has the additional quirk that the ridings differ depending on the province. So if you are voting in Newfoundland and Labrador or PEI or the Atlantic provinces generally, your ridings tend to be much smaller than in Alberta or Ontario or BC. This is because it got locked in through various constitutional provisions. For example, PEI was promised they could never have, it's constitutionalized, they can never have fewer MPs than they do senators. So they have 4 senators, they can never have fewer MPs than that. When we're doing the redistricting, we can never seem to be able to catch up and try to achieve actual equality. So even after the latest round of redistricting, Alberta and Ontario are still radically underrepresented in the parliament. And if you take seriously the idea that one person, one vote, that we're all equal, that is the foundation of majority rule, is the idea that, if you don't have majority, if it's minority rule, that means the voters for the minority have more powerful votes than the voters in the majority. So the idea is pretty basic to our democracy, that each vote should count equally, and it just simply is not the case in Canada. And on both those measures, both the deviation in the size of the ridings and the deviation in the effective weight for the parties, the distortions from first past the post, on both those measures, we have among the most unequal franchises, if not the most unequal, in the democratic world. Like, it's quantifiable. There's been studies. So there's a couple of small examples where it's not just every country has its problems. We're manifestly doing worse than other countries.
All right. So that's how we elect our individual MPs. And I think we don't actually get to vote directly for who our prime minister is going to be. It's only indirect. Every time I cast a vote for a national election, I have to have some weighting in my head, and I'm sure it's different for each person, between the individual candidate that I like. If I really like, this individual is particularly good or poor, so gets or loses my vote. The party, because I have certain political preferences, and some parties are closer to my preferences or not. And the leader of the party, because they carry a lot of weight. They have a lot of power, and that's what I want to talk to you about next. Is, all right. So I've voted, and yay, the candidate I voted for ended up winning in my riding, and so I now have an elected MP. But what is the role of the MPs, and how much power and influence do they actually have? Are they I'm told from political science classes and civics courses that they are to be a local representative. They represent everybody, not just that who voted for them. But how much do they actually do? How much autonomy do they have as individuals to represent local concerns? And how much are they simply rubber stamping party policy? Can you talk about the role of the individual MP? And let's assume, for the sake of this question, we're talking about a backbencher, not someone in the leadership position or the leadership rung of the party.
They're almost entirely ciphers. They're almost entirely foot soldiers, voting machines, whatever you want to call them. Let's again go through the what we think we elect MPs to do and what they actually do. So, what do we send our MPs to do? Well, we want them to debate legislation. Well, the debates have become entirely meaningless and rote. Oftentimes, the speeches are written for them. Certainly, the message is drafted for them that they have to stick to. Whenever a debate threatens to become interesting or lively or important, the government can simply cut it off by invoking what's called time allocation. That used to be exceedingly rare in Canada. The biggest parliamentary ruckus in our history, the so-called pipeline debate in 1956, was triggered, went on for weeks, was triggered because the government of the day invoked closure for the first time in 22 years. And people were properly outraged that, the people's house had been muffled in this way. It now happens virtually all the time now. I mean, when there's a majority government, again, there's numbers on this. When there's the last two majority governments, the Harper majority and the Trudeau first government, the bills, I'm just going by memory here, but it was something on this order that 70 or 80% of the bills were passed with the help of time allocation, which is a slightly gentler version of closure, but amounts to much the same thing. So debates really cease to have really a whole lot of relevance in Parliament.
For those that don't know what time allocation or closure is that basically where the government says, here's a bill, you have X number of hours, we're going to devote 10 hours, 20 hours, 100 hours to debate, but once that time is up, bam, time's up and we're voting. Is that how that works?
That's closer to being time allocation. Closure is more immediate. It's the debate shall cease. I think it's at the end of the day or when the question is called, or I forget the exact details of it. But yeah, time allocation is there is a certain amount of time left for debate. And whereas other countries that might have somewhat similar provisions, it's generally there's some kind of cross-party consultation, or you involve the speaker in the decision. In Canada, it is entirely the prerogative of the governing party. If they have a majority, all they have to do is pass a motion to invoke time allocation, and that's all she wrote. So it's used more frequently in Canada and with much less cross-party collaboration or attendance to opposition concerns. It's used much more brutally, shall we say. Okay, so that's debate. Well, we want MPs. Do we want them to be able to propose legislation in the U.S. Congress? Of course, that's how you measure how well a congressman has done. Is how many bills does he get passed or co-sponsor, et cetera. In Canada, it almost never happens. We pass 2 or 3 private members' bills in a typical year. They'll generally be very anodyne stuff like, National Seal Appreciation Day or what have you. Most MPs will go through their entire parliamentary careers without ever, seeing a piece of legislation that they sponsored passed into law. So that's pretty much on the margins. Used to be a bigger deal in Canada, really not anymore. Scrutinize and amend legislation in committees. People sometimes get misty-eyed about the role of committees, and sometimes, particularly in the past, committees had a bit more of an independent role. They are really very much under the party leaders' thumbs now, not just the prime minister, but the other party leaders. The committee members are chosen by them. The committee chairs are ostensibly elected by the committee, but everyone knows who the party leadership choices are, so that's decided as well. And if committees were ever threatened to be able to do their job, it's pretty much neutered when you bring in these massive omnibus bills that combine dozens of different pieces of legislation of vastly disparate purpose, hundreds of pages long, Makes it impossible to know what Parliament really meant when they voted for it, which parts they supported and which parts they didn't. And it makes it very difficult for committees to actually give them the proper scrutiny they deserve. Committees are supposed to be very specialized, have a very specialized knowledge, but these sprawling omnibus bills that cover the waterfront makes that pointless. And then finally, I guess we ultimately we want MPs to vote on legislation, to represent us. The most important role of all, perhaps, to represent us in votes on legislation. Well, I think everybody knows by now, but again, the numbers are quite staggering. In I think it was the 2015 Parliament, maybe the 2019 one, the Samara Center did a study that said that MPs voted with their parties 99.6% of the time.
And that's across all parties, not just the government.
Across all parties, that's the average. There was only, I believe, one MP who broke with his party so much as 2%, who crossed the 2% threshold. In Britain, that would be more like 20% of MPs break with their party that much. So we have the most rigid system of party discipline. And so, there's an age-old debate about it. Should MPs vote their conscience, or should they vote the way their constituencies want them to vote? Well, our MPs aren't doing either. They're just simply voting the way the party leadership tells them, because the MPs, they are, from the beginning, they are under the control of the party leadership. Supposing I mean, it's very interesting. They do these exit interviews where MPs, after they've left, ruefully admit that they basically got nothing done, had no impact whatsoever. But I'm sure they all went in saying, I'm going to be the exception. I'm the rebel. I'm going to do what I want to do. If you go in with that attitude, chances are you will not be chosen, or you will not be nominated. Most party candidates are not chosen in contested leadership races, though those are a mess. But most of the time, they're in one shape or form or another, they are chosen by the party leadership. So if you show any sign of being independent minded, you won't get selected. Let's supposing you slip through and you get elected, you get to Parliament, you will find every means of advancement is controlled by the party leadership. If you want to be a critic, or a party critic, or a cabinet minister, if you want to be a parliamentary secretary, if you want to sit on committees, if you want to go on, travel, if you want to have a nice office, all these things are controlled by the party leadership. But more than that, your fellow MPs are not particularly interested in your independence of mind. Chances are, if you're in some crisis of conscience, they will look at you and say, you and your precious conscience. And I'll give you a classic example of this. When Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was then a cabinet minister, rebelled against the prime minister for having interfered or attempted to interfere in a criminal prosecution, about as serious a charge as there is, and eventually left cabinet, and Jane Philpott resigned from cabinet in solidarity with her. That wasn't enough. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, at the time, kicked them out of caucus, which is, again, the personal prerogative of party leaders in Canada. At least it has been until now. When he kicked them out of caucus to really rub their noses in it, when it was announced in caucus, they stood and cheered. So they didn't side with their fellow MPs who were rebelling against the man. They identified with the man, because that's, there's a certain self-selection to begin with. If you run for Parliament knowing what we all know about the role of MPs, then you're kind of okay with your own subservience. So there's a self-selection. There's determined winnowing out of anybody who's got any likelihood of showing any rebellious streak. There's the system of rewards and punishments, and weighed against all that is the fact that the party leaders are not chosen by the people that they lead. It used to be the case in Canada, it is the case in other Westminster democracies, that the party leaders are chosen by the party caucus. That's their job, is to lead the caucus in Parliament. If you think Parliament matters, you're going to think that's a big part of their job. If you think MPs are important people, you're going to think it's okay that they choose the person who leads them. In Canada, we haven't had that for 100 years. So MPs, the party leaders are chosen by the membership at large, which is to say not the membership at large, but the members plus the hundreds of thousands of instant members that are signed up in the course of the race. An electoral college that disappears the moment it has finished its job of choosing the leader. So from that point on, the leader is effectively accountable to nobody. So imagine if we had a different system. Imagine if MPs and candidates were actually nominated by their local riding associations rather than being dependent upon the party leader for their opportunity.
So you mentioned that this is one of the things that came as a surprise to me when reading your book, because I was under the impression that, I as I said, I live in downtown Toronto, so we have Liberal and Conservative and NDP candidates in every election, federally and provincially. And although I'm not involved in party politics, my assumption was, I only really learn about the candidates once they're on the ballot. But my assumption was, we reliably in my riding elect Liberal or NDP. I don't think there's been a Conservative that's won in my riding in a while. But if you're a Liberal or NDP, you've got a good shot of winning in my particular riding. So I imagine that there's going to be several people vying for that spot. And that I know it's like the local, again, I'm imagining it's the local members of the Liberal or the NDP or Conservative, whatever parties that take a look at the 3 or 7 candidates and choose who's going to represent them in the election. Then it goes out to the actual election and the riding elects who's going to be the MP.
Yeah.
That was my perspective. That was my assumption. Yeah. But you write in your book, and you've now said twice in this interview that that's not how it works. So can you tell me how each party actually decides who's going to represent them in each riding across the country?
And I was surprised by some of the data on this myself. I mean, I knew there were issues, but the Samara Center, again, has done research on this. And again, I'm going from memory, but it's along these lines. About half the time in recent elections, the candidate is simply chosen by the party leadership. They're just appointed. The proportions vary between different parties, but the average overall is about half. Of the ones that remain, something like 2/3 are chosen by acclamation. So somebody stands and nobody stands against them. Oftentimes, the reason nobody stands against them is everybody knows that they have the support of the party leadership. Because when there are contested races, a lot of the times there's a favored candidate, and the organizers put their thumb on the scales in one way or another. There are just awful horror stories about, people are told, you have one day to sign up new members to vote for you. We didn't tell you this. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be like if you're a Liberal running in a rural Alberta riding, or if you're a Conservative running in a downtown urban Ontario riding, like you're not going to win under those circumstances. There's not much point in you want to have a name on the ballot, but you're not going to have.
And that's probably responsible for many of the appointed candidates.
Yeah. Appointed or acclamated. We want to have a name on the ballot, but you're not going to win just based on it.
It's hardly a satisfactory situation, though, is it? I'll come back to that but just let me finish this point first. So many of them are elected by acclamation. The ones where there are contested races, oftentimes they're not clean races. There's various shenanigans that go on in the organization, and then there's shenanigans from the candidates themselves, because the way we choose party nominees in races is similar to the way we choose party leaders is busloads of instant members. It's who can sign up new members the quickest, stack the meeting on nomination night. And it's very, very unseemly. Oftentimes there's dirty tricks involved where, the supporters of one candidate can't find parking spaces, mysteriously. So it's a really messed up process. But you mentioned, there's a lot of ridings where it doesn't really matter who the candidates are everybody knows who's going to win. These are the so-called safe ridings. Which can be as many as half or more of the ridings. Every election, my colleagues and I will write pieces starting the election campaign about the quote-unquote battleground ridings. And it never seems to occur to us how absurd this concept is, because I would have thought naively that every riding should be a battleground. I thought that's the point of having an election, that you don't have foregone conclusions. And that comes back to, again, to first past the post. When it's just a matter of who's got the fustest with the mostest, then the riding has been conservative or liberal for ages on end, then it leads people to assume that's the way the riding will always be. And then when you aggregate that across regions, you have whole regions in this country, that are for one party or another. The Liberals have not won a majority of the seats in Western Canada since 1949. The Conservatives have carried Quebec precisely 3 times since 1887. So these are these vast kind of regional ghettos. We don't really have national parties. Now we do when you look at the popular vote. So Liberals get election after election in Western Canada will get 20-25% of the vote, but a handful of seats. Similarly, the Conservatives will get 20% of the vote in Quebec and get a handful of the seats. So it distorts our politics. It makes our country will be regionalized enough as it is, just from the natural order of things, but our electoral system makes it vastly worse. If you look at, there was a minor crisis after this most recent election where people were predicting that if the Liberals got elected again, Alberta would revolt and would separate. And lo and behold, the election comes and the Liberals win only 2 seats. And people say, aha, you see? Well, the Liberals got 30% of the vote in Alberta this time. It's the best result they've had since 1968, but they still got only 2 seats. Now, I would be the first to tell you, I don't think the Liberals have paid a lot of interest or attention to Alberta's concerns and interests over the years. I think Alberta's right to be fed up with them. But if I was a Liberal and I was being honest about it, maybe over a beer, and you asked me about it, I'd say, well, why should we pay attention to Alberta? We can't win any seats there. And then if after another beer, if he was being really honest, he'd say, why should we pay attention to Alberta? Because we don't need to win seats there. We've already racked up all the seats we need by the same process in reverse. Our vote is clumped in Quebec and Ontario, so we've got all the seats we need coming out of central Canada. That's crazy. Imagine if instead we had a system in which every party could win seats in every part of the country, and every party had to win seats in every part of the country to have any chance of forming a government. We'd have genuinely national politics. There'd still be regional divisions, but we'd have genuinely national politics where you couldn't play one region off against another. You'd need to win seats based on your vision for the country as a whole.
Yeah, and that was a real eye-opener for me when I came to that part in your book, because I've heard in the media so often about red states and blue states in the United States of America. It's a Republican state or a Democrat state. But if you look at some of those states that are reliably red or reliably blue, often it's like 55% of the population Republican and 40-45% goes Democrat. But the whole state, because of the nature of the Electoral College, the whole state is painted red, or on the flip side, the whole state is painted blue with a majority, but not a stonking one to say that it's and there are very few actual states that are predominantly red or predominantly blue. They exist, but the nature of that discourse is far greater than the actual way that people vote, and that was also true in Canada. Actually, quite surprised me. I didn't think of it in those. It's
the same in Canadian provinces, and it's the same at the riding level. So the best description of our system isn't first past the post or single member plurality. I think the most accurate description is winner take all. You get 35% of the vote, but you get all the representation.
All right. One more.
OPS gets to be represented.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk one more issue, and then I want to move on to what we can do about it. So the last issue that I want to discuss is the concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office. So I'm old enough to remember the media decrying that there was an unprecedented concentration of power under John Chrétien. Yeah. When he was prime minister, and then when we briefly had Martin, another Liberal, as prime minister, he talked about the democratic deficit, and he made a couple of motions in the direction of decentralizing power. And Harper, who was opposition at the time, also was decrying the concentration of power in the prime minister's office. And then we elected the Conservatives, and over the course of the nearly 10 years where we had Harper as prime minister, concentration of power increased significantly under Harper. And then Justin Trudeau won the Liberal leadership race, and when he was in opposition, he decried this unprecedented concentration of power. And then again, after nearly a decade in power, we ousted the Conservatives, we installed the Liberals, and then the concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office continued again under the Liberals, under Trudeau. And I'm not going to make a judgment yet about Carney. It's been it hasn't been enough time to evaluate that. So it's really only gone in one direction for over 20 years, and even quite possibly before then. So how is the concentration? I'd like you to talk about how is it that what is it that prime ministers can do today that they couldn't do 20 years ago, and why is this a ratchet that seems only to move in one direction?
That's a good question. So yes, it has gotten worse. If you look at international studies, there's a common consensus that the Canadian Prime Minister is probably the most powerful within his realm of any democratically elected head of government. We used to say there could never be a Watergate in Canada, because if any prime minister tried to do what Richard Nixon did, he'd be out in his ear, he'd lose a vote of no confidence, et cetera. But we've had multiple scandals, maybe not as bad as Watergate, but we've had multiple scandals involving prime ministers in the last couple of decades, and nobody laid a glove on them. Committees were shut down without hearing all the witnesses. Police investigations went nowhere. A prime minister in Canada is almost untouchable. The prime minister stands at the intersection of two broad trends that I talk about in the book and that we've talked about here: the primacy of party leaders over their caucuses, because the prime minister is a party leader himself, and the primacy of the government over the parliament. The fact that the leader of the government, the prime minister again, can decide when parliament sits and when it doesn't sit, when legislation is passed, what's a confidence vote, when to prorogue, when to dissolve parliament, when to cut off debate, when to invoke omnibus. All these powers are basically the personal prerogative of the prime minister. So that would make him enormously powerful in and of itself. And a lot of the things that were supposed to constrain prime ministers and have constrained them in the past are kind of conventions. They're what's called the decent chaps idea. As long as decent chaps are running things, we don't need to worry too much about the vast powers that we've invested in the prime minister. But if decent chaps aren't running things, or if they decide they're not going to be bound by these conventions, then the system kind of seizes up. We don't have the kind of formal institutional constraints that can force them to observe these conventions.
If everybody behaved decently, we wouldn't need any criminal laws at all.
Right? That's right.
But we have to assume that someone is going to act in a bad way, and there needs to be otherwise there's nothing to stop a malicious person, should such a person exist. And unfortunately, we have plenty of evidence that malicious people do exist. There needs to be ways to constrain and prevent and mitigate their malicious acts.
Powers that the prime minister has over the legislative branch. Mm-hmm. Now, within the executive branch and the judicial branch, he has unrivaled powers of appointment. He appoints, first of all, every member of the Senate, which makes us stand out. Even all on its own, the Senate would make Canada as an outlier. The British have the House of Lords, but when you look at the record of appointments going back to 1958, the percentage of appointees to the House of Lords that were from the governing party versus non-governing party is roughly 50-50. In Canada, it's 98% appointed from the governing side.
I'm astonished that there were 2% that were not from the governing party. I can't
rare slip through. So there's the Senate. He appoints every member of the Supreme Court. He appoints all the deputy ministers. He appoints the heads of the armed forces, the head of the RCMP. Virtually every position of any consequence is basically the prime minister's personal prerogative to appoint. Now, again, in other countries, prime ministers have quite wide-ranging powers of appointment, but for the powerful jobs particularly, there's usually some external independent oversight of some kind. Either you got to put it through Parliament, or there's some panel that you have to consult, et cetera. We're only beginning to experiment with these in Canada. Justin Trudeau brought in what I think are widely regarded as fairly toothless panels to advise him on Supreme Court appointments and Senate appointments, but it really does remain his prerogative, and he appoints all the members of the advisory panels, et cetera. So it's the degree to which it's so completely in the control of the prime minister that really makes that power stand out. And then, of course, there's the cabinet. We have, even today, even after Mark Carney has reduced the size of the cabinet, we still have the largest, maybe the second largest, but I'm pretty close to the largest cabinet in the democratic world. Certainly when we were coasting around about 40, we had by far the largest cabinet in the democratic world, maybe even the undemocratic world. And it's not coincidental that as the size of the cabinet has grown, because it didn't used to be this way. Mackenzie King fought a depression and a world war with a cabinet of 16. Lester Pearson built the modern welfare state with a cabinet of 22. It's quite recently that it's grown to 40. Other countries, the OECD average is 19. Britain's is 22. France's is, I think, 17. Anybody who sat in any kind of committee knows once you get past about 12, it starts to break down. There's not a lot of useful work done as a committee. And as the size grows further and further, each of the individual members of cabinet become less and less of any consequence. In any cabinet, there'll be maybe 4 or 5 who have any real independence role, whatever. They're the ones who have the prime minister's ear, basically. The rest of them are placeholders and spokesmen. So cabinet has become really devalued. At the same time, the size of the prime minister's office, the set of bureaucrats working directly for him and political staff, has grown to 120. I should say political staff, not bureaucrats. The bureaucrats are in the Privy Council office, which also reports to the prime minister. That's vastly larger than any similar office for any parliamentary system I could find. So cabinet diminishing, even as it gets larger, prime minister's office becoming more and more powerful. And the really sad and pathetic thing is, one of the instruments for enforcing party discipline on the governing side is the idea that if you keep your nose clean and don't make too much trouble, you might get into cabinet. Take you a long while, but you might get into cabinet. And so everybody plays along and stifles their doubts and doesn't cause any trouble. They get into cabinet. It's no different. They're still nobodies.
So there's things. There's one word that we haven't mentioned. So we've been talking for about 45 minutes now, and there's one word that and everything that we've talked about has not come up. We've talked about selection of who's going to be the candidates. We've talked about the actual elections. We're talking about omnibus bills. We're talking about who becomes prime minister, who becomes into cabinet. One word that has not come out of either of our mouths so far is the word merit. Right? And so cabinet positions, and theoretically, increased power, it's based on seniority, it's based on loyalty, it's based on pliancy, perhaps, and not based on merit. There's a great song in the musical Hamilton that I want to be in the room where it happens. And so you think, as a civilian, just as a regular guy, I want to be in Parliament. I want to be in the House of Commons because that's the room where it happens. But actually, not. We've talked about it, and not much happens there. All right, I've been an MP for a while. I want to be in cabinet because that's the room where it happens. But then if there's 40 people, there's another room where the real decisions get made. And what you're saying is that it's all the room where it happens is the prime minister's office, all of it, or at least far too much of it for a healthy, robust democratic nation.
You don't want to overstate it. Even in the earliest days, cabinet was always a mixture of various types of criteria. You had to be a member of the governing party, first of all. You had to be a supporter of the prime minister. Okay. There were regional and linguistic concerns from the start in terms of representation. So I don't want to say there's ever been some age when it was pure merit. And as many people would point out, it really helped if you were white and male. So there wasn't a lot of search for merit amongst the female half the population. So that's all true.
That's a fair qualification to put in, yeah.
But what certainly happened over the years, however, and especially in recent decades, is it's just we one of the things that comes up in the book is X or Y thing that I decry, I'll say, up to a certain point, this is perfectly defensible. We've just taken it to the extreme. And this is another example of it. Some element of representativeness is always going to be part of the mix in a cabinet. It is in other countries as well. But we've just taken it to the extreme where it's all about representatives and the representativeness. And the more the various markers of identity that you're trying to cover off, you're not just doing region now, you're doing region and language and religion and gender and sexual preference and ethnicity and everything under the sun. And it's not to say that those aren't valid concerns to be thinking about, but representativeness is supposed to be the function of the parliament. The function of cabinet is supposed to be governing the country. And the less that anybody takes seriously the idea that cabinet is elected to actually govern, the less seriously people take the idea that each individual member of cabinet is responsible for his or her own portfolio and for bringing forward policy and then collectively sitting in judgment and advising the prime minister and sometimes saying no to the prime minister and these kinds of things. The less seriously we take that idea, the more that we all understand, come on, it's not like that. They're basically just appointed hacks. Then the more it defaults into representativeness. And it just kind of feeds on itself, and nobody, when there's a cabinet appointed in Canada, it's really striking when you watch the coverage. Nobody asks about this or that minister, what talents or skills or background or ability they bring to the job. Nobody says, is this person going to signal a change in approach in the government? It's all just head counting. It's all just how many were from the West and how many from the East and how many from rural and how many from urban. We've kind of given up on the idea of taking them seriously as individual players pretty much altogether. And so these, as I say, these things kind of feed on each other. It becomes a vicious circle.
All right. So I'm hoping that for most of our audience, you've made a fairly convincing case that we have a real problem as a democracy in Canada, and it's institutional, it's structural, and this isn't about the fact that we've had one party in power for 10 years and then the other party in power for 10 years before that, roughly. This isn't a partisan attack. Let's go on the assumption that there are no saints in the world. Not that everyone is venal, but we can't count on perfect, virtuous MPs or leaders from any party. Where do we go from here? Because if I'm the prime minister, right, I like power, right? Even if it's noble, I have noble ends. I don't want more accountability. I don't want more roadblocks. Even if I'm trying to do only good things for the nation, anything that gets in my way is going to hobble my ability to improve things for Canadians. So I like the fact that I can choose my MPs, that I can choose my cabinet, that I can railroad Parliament. That means I can get stuff done as Prime Minister. And you, Mr. Journalist, Mr. Coyne, all you want to do is throw roadblocks. I'm only going to get through half of my agenda, maybe a quarter, maybe not any of it. If suddenly, the opposition party who got slightly fewer votes, or even maybe in one case, more in the popular vote than I did, but I'm still the prime minister, great. If I give them more power, if I release my grasp, I'm not going to accomplish nearly as much in my time as prime minister than I would otherwise. So, and so how do we actually change things? What can we change? What should we change? Because your book is not just a polemic about how awful things are, but I'd like you to spend a few minutes talking about how it can be different and why it would be an improvement, please.
Well, it's a dilemma, first of all, as you say, that people do the worst things for the best reasons. The more sincerely high-minded they are, the more ruthless they become for the reasons you're saying, and what that does to reform is it puts up these roadblocks. There's all kinds of reforms that people have talked about over the years, and I'll go through a few of them now. If we're talking about the role of MPs versus the party leader, you could move back to a system where, first of all, the caucus elects the leader rather than the party at large, so that That makes the leader have to be really accountable to the caucus on a day-to-day basis. One of the themes of the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day, but every day in between. If you really want to have accountable party leaders, then you need a body that can hold them to account on a day-to-day basis. That body is the caucus. And similarly, take away the power of the leader to appoint MPs, take away the power that the leader has to deny them nominations. So this is one of the most significant powers, is even if somebody's been a sitting MP for eons, he or she depends on the party leader's favor to be nominated again. They can be vetoed if they step out of line. So redressing the balance between party leaders and caucus members is a big part of it. And those two measures would be critical to that. When it comes in terms of the government's control over Parliament, a lot of the suggested reforms amount to taking what are now personal prerogatives of the Prime Minister, to prorogue, to dissolve, for example, to cut off debate, and either giving them, in some cases, assigning them to the Speaker of the House, and in some cases requiring a vote of the House, and maybe even a supermajority of the House in some cases. So that it's not just simply a wave of the prime ministerial finger that decides when these important, again, nothing wrong. There are going to be measures. There are going to be times when you need to cut off debate. There's going to be times when prorogation is advisable. These, they're not wrong in themselves. It's just they've been so abused. So as I say, distributing some of those powers away from the party leaders and away from the prime minister. Well, the catch is, the only way that can happen is if the party leaders themselves, and the prime minister in particular, decide that they should. Why would they want to do so, since that's the basis of their power? Catch-22. Similarly with electoral reform, we run into this time and time again. Parties will run on a campaign saying we're going to bring in electoral reform, Justin Trudeau being the classic example, because they hope to win votes for it. And then once they get into power, on having been elected under first past the post, they discover they don't want to move away from first past the post anymore. Or in the rare cases where we've had referendums on it, as I say, I mentioned the referendum in BC where electoral reform got 58% of the vote, but the government had carefully arranged to make sure that the threshold was 60%.
Right.
This is a government that was elected itself with, I think, 42% of the vote, but 60% to change it. So it's very, very difficult. I would like to see electoral reform. I would like to see mandatory voting. There's a whole range of reforms that I talk about in the book. But the meta question is, how do you surmount this catch-22, the ultimate vicious circle? And I have two possible avenues. One is you just get the ball rolling somewhere. You start small. But a lot of these things that are now vicious circles, if you can just start to reverse the polarity, they turn into virtuous circles. So the small glimmer of hope, very small, was the passage and subsequent use of the Reform Act. This was the bill sponsored by the reformist conservative MP Michael Chong in 2015. It was a huge struggle to get it passed. All the party leaders were against it. He had to water it down a huge amount. But what he managed to get through was that party caucuses could have four powers that are now the preserves of the party leaders, could be assumed by the party caucuses if the party caucuses voted to assume them. So after each election, they're required by law to have a caucus meeting and have a vote on whether to assume these powers. Now, the catch is, again, that it's not a secret ballot. So in most of the cases, the party leaders have put out the word, you are not to vote for this, and the caucuses have obediently refused to do so. The exception was the Conservatives. And they, in the first instance, voted to assume two or three of the other powers, I don't need to get into right now, but the really important one that they eventually got around was taking on the power to remove the party leader. It's extremely difficult right now to remove a party leader. It happens. It happened to Justin Trudeau. It happened to Jean Chrétien, but it's extremely rare. And it
usually resigned, right? They weren't kicked out.
Forced out, though. It's pretty clear they were forced out. I don't think anybody would dispute that they didn't go of their own accord. But it's a very messy process because nobody knows what the rules are. Nobody knows what the threshold you have to get to require them to step down or to require a vote of some kind. Everything's conducted in the shadows. And so what happens is you have these brutal 3-year-long slugfests that drain the party that divided, et cetera. Whereas once you've got it entrenched in law that a certain number of signatures means you have to have a vote, and you go to the vote and it's all over, Aaron O'Toole was removed in a matter of, I think, 3 days. Now, it's only half finished because we haven't given the caucus the power to choose the new leader. So if you do topple your leader, you're not finishing that and moving on. You're plunging the party into a months-long leadership process. So I would prefer that we also gave the caucus the power to choose a new leader, as, for example, when Margaret Thatcher was replaced. It's all done in the space of about a week. But nevertheless, just this one little thing. And you'll notice that the Conservatives recently had a vote and renewed this power with regard to Pierre Poilievre. There was some question about whether they would have. Probably they wouldn't have if he'd won the election. But nevertheless, Pierre Poilievre now has to really look over his shoulder at members of his caucus. He's got to be very attentive to their needs and interests, because if he doesn't, he could be out in his ear. Now, maybe over time, not going to say it's going to happen anytime soon, but maybe eventually other parties look at that conservative model and say, geez, I'd like to be able to do that in my party. And maybe that becomes the norm. And maybe if the parties do that, if the caucuses assume that power and they therefore redress the balance with the leader a little bit, maybe at that point, caucus members start going, you know what? I'd like to ask my own questions in Parliament. Thank you very much. I'm tired of having to, have my questions written for me and having to get on the leaders list in order to be allowed to ask a question in Parliament. And maybe they start demanding that power. And maybe these things feed on themselves where they start to feel themselves to be somebody's rather than nobody's. I'm not saying I have a huge amount of hope for that, but stranger things have happened once you get the ball rolling. So that's one process. The other process is we get ourselves into a massive crisis. I think we're a good way there already. We have enormous challenges facing us as a country. A lot of it driven by Donald Trump being the president, but the whole things that have come from that about how we have to just rethink our whole place in the world and how much we spend on defense and who we trade with and our economic policy. So there's a major rethink that's in order for the country. If we try to make the policy decisions the way we have in the past, where a party gets in with 35 or 38% of the vote, most of it from one part of the country, and rams through these major changes, that another part of the country says, wait a minute, this is hugely damaging to our interests. We don't want this. I'm not saying we're going to break up the country, but we could certainly lead ourselves into a terrible impasse. And people, in extremis, people can find ways to obstruct the business of government, the business of Parliament. Just look at the way, for example, Indigenous groups have been able to tie things up by blockading railways, for example. So we could get ourselves into a really bad situation. And it may be, the optimistic scenario in that is, at some point, maybe we look around and we say, we got to change the way we make decisions in this country. We've given all this enormous power to the Prime Minister, and he's hugely powerful on Parliament Hill, but he doesn't have any legitimacy off Parliament Hill. Nobody looks at that Parliament and says, that's my Parliament. I'm confident that Parliament will hold the government to account, and therefore people don't look at the government and say, okay, that's a government that has to be in close touch with the people and is accountable, et cetera. So this is ultimately the crisis, is a crisis of legitimacy. And a crisis of legitimacy ultimately becomes a crisis of power. You're not able to get stuff done. And maybe in the middle of that crisis, we come to that realization. And my hopeful, optimistic ending to this story is, as I mentioned in the book, is that's how our country was founded. The province of Canada, as it then was, a single province combining Upper and Lower Canada, now today, Ontario and Quebec, but it was a single province then, and they were deadlocked. There was a deadlock between the members representing the different parts of the province. There was a deadlock between the Conservatives and the Reformers. Nothing was getting done. They were just, wasting their time. And eventually, they realized we've got to change the system. We've got to bring in other provinces and have a different electoral proportion of seats. And what really drove it was George Brown, the leader of the Reformer Party, crossed the floor to join a grand coalition with Sir John A. Macdonald, his hated enemy. And that's what kicked things off. And they made the larger choices and the larger changes that broke the deadlock and broke the impasse and made the country that we know and love today possible. So, I hope it doesn't have to come to that. I hope if it does come to that, we'll have the visionary leaders who will be able to step outside their past ways of doing things. But if not, then we're headed for, I think, real problems as a country.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andrew Coyne. This has been a fantastic conversation. If people want to read Crisis of Canadian Democracy, available at the libraries and fine bookstores everywhere, where else can people find your work?
The book or my work generally?
People have heard you want to learn about you.
Yeah, I'm a columnist for the Globe and Mail newspaper, and so you can find my work in better newsstands still to this day, but also online. And I'm pretty regularly on the former Twitter, now X. And yeah, you can buy the book either in bookstores or again from various online retailers, including Sutherland House itself, which is my publisher. They probably would prefer you buy it directly from them. I think they get a larger share of the proceeds. So
I'm happy to support Canadian publishers, so please do so. Thank you for taking the time speaking with me today on Podcast for an Inquiry. This has been an enlightening conversation.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.